History is filled with blunders, with great mistakes made by those who couldn't afford to make them. Some of these blunders changed history so drastically, almost everything about our modern political landscape has been shaped by them in one shape or form. Take for example World War II, during which the German Third Reich rapidly expanded its borders to engulf almost all of Europe. It seemed victory was in their grasp. Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, and others all fell in months. It seemed they were unstoppable. And then, they invaded Russia. The invasion of Russia is a hotly debated topic today. Many argue if the Nazis had never invaded Russia, they would have surely won the war. Others believe that the American-British effort would have been able to bring the Reich down without the Soviet Union at all. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter. The Germans were never going to not invade the Soviet Union. It was the culmination of their entire ideology. The capture of Lebensraum, or living space, from the Slavic people in the East who they viewed as subhuman. Not only that, because of the racism I just described, they believed it was going to be an easy fight. Surely the Soviets would just roll over and surrender. As Hitler said, we only need to kick the door in, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. But what if, against all realistic possibilities, they didn't? What if the Germans decided, for whatever reason, to stay true to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact they had signed in 1939, to maintain peace with the Soviet Union at least until 1949. How would this change the war? Let's discuss. It is June 22nd, 1941, and the Eastern Front between the Germans and Soviets is quiet, with no signs of that changing anytime soon. Another big part of this scenario is that the Soviets also decide to follow the stipulations of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. There would be no war between the Germans and the Soviets, at least not until the specified date of 1949, when the pact would end. So where do the Germans send the troops that in our timeline were meant for the invasion of Russia? My best guess? North Africa. Rommel in our timeline was able to recover the North African front from the defeats the Italians had suffered before, and had nearly pushed the Allies fully out of Libya. All that was left was a stubborn garrison at Tobruk. Tobruk was needed as an important supply hub if the Axis were ever to push into Egypt, but no amount of troops was ever going to break this siege. Tobruk was a fortress. The greatest engineering minds in Britain designed its defenses, and it was able to be supplied by the superior British Navy. However, the Axis did enjoy, and would continue to enjoy, aerial superiority. And with more troops and the German high command not being distracted by an invasion of the Soviet Union, I believe the Germans could hold back the Allies during Operation Crusader and keep control of Libya into 1942. Now is when the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, would begin to recover from its losses it sustained during the Battle of Britain. Without having to split off to support the invasion of the Soviets, the Germans would be able to maintain complete aerial supremacy over mainland Europe, and would spare themselves of any bombings that would damage their operational integrity in their conquered lands. In short, during 1941, Germany would be able to bunker down and turn themselves into a fortress, perhaps even antagonizing the British Air Force and Navy in the English Channel. However, one event in 1941 would surely remain consistent with our own timeline. The attack on Pearl Harbor is an inevitability, and no changes in this timeline would have prevented it from occurring. The Japanese still bomb the American fleet, America still declares war on Japan, and the Germans still declare war on the Americans. The World War had escalated. Things in Europe would remain largely the same until about June 1942, when the Americans would regain the initiative against Japan, thus meaning they could begin to focus on the war in Europe. Fortress Germany still awaits to be cracked. The air war would escalate, with the Americans now joining the fray. However, I doubt the Allies would be able to destroy the Luftwaffe in Europe. However, with American air support and maybe even troops on the ground, I believe the Allies could break Libya and push the Axis out. They could even shortly execute Operation Torch, pushing the Vichy French out of Morocco and Algeria. Now the Germans would have to worry about both coasts, both north and south. From here, things would be largely the same for a period of time. During 1943, the Allies would launch an invasion of Sicily and Italy, which would then prompt the Italians to oust Mussolini and surrender. The Germans would then invade and disarm the Italians during Operation Axis. Mussolini would be reinstated by the Germans over the Italian Social Republic. A brutal and bloody campaign would continue until winter, when a stalemate would solidify in southern Italy. And finally, we reach 1944, the year of D-Day. By this point, Roosevelt would see that the Italian campaign would not be the route to victory, and would press Churchill into agreeing to an invasion of France from the north. And so it was, that in June 1944, the Allies would take the fight back to France. Without being able to wrangle air supremacy from the Germans, Allied paratroopers are mostly shot down before being able to take their objectives. During the landings, the Allies are just barely able to secure their beaches. But then, the bombings begin. Under constant barrage, the Allies are pinned down and advance far slower than what was hoped. The Allies had overestimated their own abilities to beat back the Luftwaffe, and even their supply ships were forced to only supply the invasion under the cover of darkness. The Allies were bogged down, and then the tanks arrived. The full might of German armor came down upon the Allied forces in their small pocket in northern France. It wasn't long until they were completely pushed out. I have no doubt that without the ability to completely crush the German Air Force, and with the entirety of the German army and especially armor focused on them, any attempt to invade France would end in failure. Even in our timeline, with the Germans divided and without any air support, the Atlantic Wall made the invasion a bloody affair, and a struggle that could have ended in defeat for the Allies. The casualty and capture count is over 100,000. And D-Day would go down as the greatest Allied defeat of the entire war. It would be now the Allies would realize that they just wouldn't be able to all-out defeat the Germans and force an unconditional surrender like Roosevelt had demanded. In the latter half of 1944, the Germans would try and capitalize on this success, launching offensives in Italy and trying to wrestle air superiority over the English Channel, and maybe even England itself. Both would be unsuccessful, and the Allies would be able to maintain the status quo. In 1945, the Americans would push the Japanese back to their home islands and would unleash their nuclear power against the Japanese in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, with a vain hope against hope that this would intimidate the Germans into surrender. However, without air superiority, both sides would know the Allies would be unable to conduct a nuclear attack against the Germans. Finally, in the winter of 1945, an armistice would be signed. While I doubt the Allies would ever accept a real treaty with the Germans, they would see that the war would be fruitless from here on out, and that continuing it would grow unpopular back at home, especially after the monumental failure at Normandy. A ceasefire would be agreed upon, but the Allies would not recognize the German holdings in Europe. Nonetheless, the Germans would reorganize the borders and entities of Europe as they please, and the war would be effectively over. Italy would remain divided in two. In the north, the Italian Social Republic would be organized into a Nazi puppet regime, and in the south, the Allies would reorganize the Kingdom of Italy, a constitutional monarchy and liberal democracy. However, it would be mostly ran by the Allied military and the Mafia. In the east, Japan would be fully defeated and occupied, just as in our timeline, and China would likely fall to the communists all the same. Thus, the New World would be born. Split not into two, like ours, following World War II, but in three, with the Allies, Germans, and the Soviets. Speaking of which, by this point the Soviet army and government would have recovered from the Great Purge which had gutted them so thoroughly before World War II in our timeline. Thus, as the non-aggression pact between the Soviets and Germans' expiration date draws closer, a bitter Cold War would begin, as well as a race to develop the nuclear bomb. The Soviets would know that if the Germans developed the bomb first, they would have the confidence to invade the Union without fear of retaliation. The Germans would know that if the Soviets got the bomb first, they would be surrounded by nuclear powers, and could be destroyed by the Allies and Soviets. My prediction is that the Soviets would develop the bomb first. They had an extensive spy network in the Manhattan Project, and the Nazis had written off nuclear science as quote-unquote Jew science for the longest time, which had put them at a disadvantage. From here, I can see two possible scenarios playing out. Shortly after the end of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviets preemptively invade the Germans before they can develop a nuclear bomb of their own. The Allies resume their own fight against the Axis shortly afterwards. The Germans desperately defend as they are slowly pushed back and squeezed by the two sides. German cities are nuked and the Reich is finally defeated. Or The Germans are able to develop the bomb before the Soviets can invade. A Cold War develops as both sides don't see nuclear annihilation as worth it. Finally, in the late 1950s or early 1960s, Hitler dies. With the Nazi economic system most likely already stalling, and their political system unable to effectively and peacefully continue on without their Führer, Germany, a nuclear power, collapses. What follows is a mess of civil war, rebellions, and revolutions, Allied and Soviet invasions, all with nuclear weaponry thrown in. In other words, a mess. As you can surely tell, I don't think the Germans could have won the Second World War by not invading the Soviets. However, instead of their fall being rapid and speedy, it's a long, drawn-out affair taking place over decades. There is a lot more I could do with this scenario and world, so who knows, perhaps I'll make a part 2 sometime. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.